Ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this side event, Culture on the Move, Sea Level Rise, Cultural Heritage and Climate Mobility. I'd like first, my name incidentally is Oliver Maurice, and I am the Director of Advocacy and Membership for the International National Trusts Organization, which I will come on to shortly and tell you a little bit about that. I would like to thank our sponsors for this side event, the International Polar Foundation, who sadly can't be here today, ICOMOS, the Arctic Institute, the Newport Restoration Foundation, and the British Embassy, not for this particular side event, but in half an hour after the end of this one, we're all rushing over to repeat the same side event at the British Embassy Pavilion in the Green Zone. I'm not going to introduce our speakers at the moment because I've asked Victoria Herrmann over here to moderate this session, and she will be doing that a little later on. But I want to introduce the topic of today's discussion. And I think I would start by saying that in the IPCC's fifth assessment report, they said that 95%, with 95% certainty, that global warming was attributed to the burning of fossil fuels. So it's pretty well definitely proven that that is the case. There are still those who don't believe it, including the Vice President-elect of the United States, sadly. But nevertheless, it is a fact, and it is causing huge problems around the world. Due to global warming, glaciers the world over are retreating. Ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic and Greenland are melting at increasing pace. And the warming of the upper level of the sea is causing the water to expand, and these three combined are leading to sea level rise. That in turn is causing coastal erosion, more frequent flooding and surges. People are having to flee their homes now, and in the future they will have to even more. And their cultural heritage, their history, and their cultures are being left behind. It's a threat to the well-being of everybody, in fact, the global warming and the sea level rise. Climate change poses a threat to all the people of the world, but its impacts will disproportionately affect the developing world. It threatens the viability of many traditional practices, indeed entire cultures that have evolved in harmony with their natural surroundings. A series of difficult questions arises if populations are forced to leave behind their territories upon which they've survived for countless generations. This is especially so for the peoples for whom the link to the land is an essential component of their lifestyle, as is the case in many of the South Pacific islands. How are cultures and identities to be maintained if people are required to leave behind their homes? Our side event today will discuss three main topics under the heading Culture on the Move, Sea Level Rise, Cultural Heritage and Climate Mobility. And these are the role of cultural heritage as a tool for integration and social cohesion, the need to preserve where possible and or document and memorialize the tangible heritage left behind by displaced communities, and the need to conserve the intangible heritage, traditional knowledge and movable heritage of displaced persons and communities. Now, before I invite Victoria Herrmann of the Arctic Institute to speak and to introduce her fellow speakers, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the International National Trust Organization. It was founded in 2007 at the International Conference of National Trusts that takes place every other year, in this case in Delhi, New Delhi in 2007. and it is an umbrella body for national and heritage trusts around the world. And the aim of each body is to conserve their patrimony, their cultural heritage, their natural heritage, and tangible and intangible cultural heritage as well. In other words, the built heritage and the customs and the cultures of that country. We have 70 members worldwide at the moment, and it's growing. We started with about 15 after the conference in 2007, and they're widespread. We have many in Asia, we have many in Africa, and many in the Americas, and many in Europe. All with a common theme: to protect and enhance the heritage for the benefit of not only this generation, but for future generations. They are all concerned with the climate change problems. And we recently conducted a climate change survey and had some interesting responses from them, that 60% of them raised the issue of raised the issue of increased rainfall as one of the main issues, and also sea level rise as one of the really main issues. 66% talked about that as being a big issue as well. We did another survey in advance of World Heritage Day in March this year, and we asked them, in terms of their world heritage, what they felt were the key issues, and climate change was up there. Also, apathy. And the apathy was the apathy on the part of governments, who they were saying were not taking sufficient notice of the cultural heritage. They take a short-term view, not a long-term view. And that, frankly, is one of the issues that we, as the International National Trust Organization and our member organizations, are faced with around the world. The governments have no budget at all, very often, for conserving their heritage. They're very often more concerned with knocking it down and building something else in its place. And that is a really big issue for us. So we have to get the message across, which is one of the reasons we're here. And it is also a concern that culture and heritage rarely gets mention at the COPs. And we've been promoting this at 6 of the last 8 COPs. And finally, this year, I'm pleased to say that I think there are no less than 10 side events where either the word culture or heritage actually comes into the title. So progress is being made at last. I'm going to now show you a 5-minute film, which I hope will put this session into context. It's the film about the plight of the inhabitants of Kiribati, who are suffering hugely from sea level rise. Thank you. If I can get it to work. We have some help.
Either we build the island itself in order to stay out of the water, or we build floating islands, or we're not here. In other words, migrate. And so it's a combination of all of these things that we have adopted as our strategy.
We need to be aware that when you're referring to heritage, you're
Either we build the islands up in order to stay out of the water, or we build floating islands, or we're not here. In other words, migrate. And so it's a combination of all of these things that we have adopted as our strategy.
We need to be aware that when you're referring to heritage, you're talking about various aspects of important aspects of your life. So we can talk about oral heritage. We can talk about heritage to do with the land, heritage to do with how we relate to people. So it's a whole broad area. The land in Kiribati is not merely a piece of real estate that you can put on the market and sell, because it's connected with your ancestry and your history as a particular clan.
With this land, I can pass it on to my children. I live on it, and I am not counted as a poor person. It gives me dignity. Our heritage is connected to our land, our culture, our language, everything that is Kiribati, our environment. That's our heritage that we are supposed to look after it, to pass on to our children and grandchildren. With the impact of climate change, one of them is we may be relocated. Biggest disaster, I think, for Kiribati people. I wouldn't know how to tell my children where I come from, especially my grandchildren, if Kiribati is not here.
Land in Kiribati is low. Land in Kiribati is very narrow in a lot of instances. And so when you talk about the challenges of climate change, it's very easy for people to say, when the sea comes, move back and move up. In Kiribati, we can't move back. You move back a few meters and you fall into the sea on the other side.
In Kiribati, you're not talking about one island country. You are talking about several islands in a country. And each island has their own unique culture. We talk about more than 20 different cultural heritage in Kiribati.
I put a question to a lot of the people in the outer island, said, do you want to migrate? Do you want to move to another country? And most of the people said, no, we don't want to. I said, how can we fish? We know our ocean well. We know our coconut trees well. We live by those things. But how can we go and fish in unfamiliar shores, seas? Like, I don't think we will be able to survive there.
The land is very important to people in Kiribati because we've got so little of it. Land is also very important, not only for the living, but also for the dead. And the line between the dead and the living in Kiribati culture is very fine. We move easily between the two. Dead ancestors are as important as the living people, and we pay first respect to them.
Well, it's a burden to think about it. Like, how can you live a land that, all your families are buried, Maybe we have to dig everything, all our families up and put them together and we go with them. Maybe that's one way, but it is hard for us. My sister was buried here. My mom was buried here. My dad buried here. And I thought about maybe I should go to Fiji or go to another country. I said, how can I go? My people are buried here.
Now people would prefer to migrate together because there is that safety in numbers. But at the same time, we have to accept that in order to adapt to the new environment, the new communities, we've got to be part of that community. We've got to be able to learn to assimilate the new society that we go into. And the question is, could we as a people hope to retain that unique identity away from Kiribati?
Thank you for that. So we're going to move into the presentation part of the panel. I'll introduce the speakers and then I'll give a little bit of context myself from my own research, and then we'll move into hopefully ample time for questions and answers. So the first speaker that's going to present after me is Erica Bauer from the UN's Refugee Agency, and she's going to give kind of the overarching context for our conversation today. What are the international processes that are currently going on, and where do each of our research and our on-the-ground work fit into that process within cultural heritage and climate change? Then we're going to hear from Andrew Potts of ICOMOS, who is going to talk a bit about what the cultural heritage community at large is doing with climate change, how we're trying to provide input into the processes that Erica will talk about, where we are and hopefully where we're going as a community. And then finally, we're going to hear from Espen Romberg from SPREP on what's happening in the Pacific region at the ground level. He's going to give us a few case studies of what he works on and what he sees in Samoa and beyond, and then bringing it back to the first speaker, Erica, and how, again, that fits into this overarching framework of where climate change meets cultural heritage in UN negotiations at large. So I'm Victoria. I am the managing director of the Arctic Institute, but I am also a National Geographic explorer. And through that program, I've had the privilege to run a qualitative research project that brings me around to about a dozen coastal communities in the United States to talk about where the intersection of cultural heritage meets climate change retreat and relocation, and what are the most salient issues that communities are facing through about 500 interviews. And I thought what would be a good start to this conversation, is going over 4 themes that I've seen and heard of throughout this research project, and what people are most concerned about losing, but also what people are using to be more resilient as they're adapting in place and looking to relocate in terms of local cultural heritage. The first area that comes up, whether I'm in Alaska or American Samoa or the Chesapeake Bay, is food, food security, food as part of culture, and food as a spiritual practice. And food is obviously intricately tied to the land or the sea that a community is around. And time and again, people bring up the fear of losing subsistence traditional knowledge and the ability to practice subsistence as sea levels rise and shoreline erosion is increased from more intense storm surges. And in the picture here, which was taken in Shaktoolik in Alaska, which is an Inupiat community, there's an intense fear that there's going to be a loss of being able to hunt marine mammals, so seals and walruses, because there's no more sea ice that protects the island from storm surges and allows community members to go out and hunt safely. This past winter, there was no sea ice at all on the shore, which meant that the community got no seals, which is not only devastating culturally, but also devastating for food security and a community that's only accessible via plane rides. So there was a shortage of food. So the idea that communities can lose their ability to practice an incredibly important way to get their food from climate change and ultimately to relocating to a new place is something that comes up time and again in my research, and I'm sure will be brought up in the other presentations. And then this is just another addition in Alaska, another subsistence practice that is being threatened is berry picking. Because of thawing permafrost, it's no longer safe, and there's different variations in water availability for the berries to grow. So where community members go out and harvest berries throughout the summer to then keep and feed on throughout the winter, they're no longer able to do that. And it's so culturally important for people to do that, that I talked to a number of community members that bought $400 plane tickets to go somewhere else in Alaska where berries were growing, in order to get that connection to the land. And so there's, sorry, it's not working. Oh, that's okay. Well, there was a picture of berry picking. The second theme that, the first slide, it's okay.
Put it on slideshow.
I'll just keep talking. The second theme that continues to come up when you talk about cultural heritage in communities that are, thank you. Great, thanks. So that was the fish, and this is the berry picking. The second theme that always comes up is the idea of social cohesion and the fear that if a community leaves and they're not relocated in full, that there will be a loss of the community feeling, which is important to the transfer of culture from generation to generation, and also to be able to keep oral histories alive. And there's already a precedent within the United States of communities being relocated either through natural processes like erosion or because of policy choices, where a community was co-located and the support infrastructure wasn't set up to ensure that community cohesion existed in that new place. And this is seen in Alaska with King Island moving to Nome, which is a larger city, and that community dispersing and no longer having a central location where they can come together and make moccasins, for example, which is what you see in this picture in Shishmaref, another Inupiat community in Alaska. And time and again in interviews, people say that there's this loss of feeling of belonging when they move to a new place. And people in Shishmaref bring up King Island as an example of what they're afraid of with the potential to relocate from climate change. This is also something that's brought up in American Samoa, where communities are not looking to relocate in full, but are retreating from a shoreline, and they look around and they see their neighbors, which will be brought up later, and how they're dealing with social cohesion and what it means to move as a community to another nation. And it's something that they bring up in the 100+ interviews that I did. In 94% of them, people brought up the fear of losing the sense of community and being integral to who they were as American Samoans. The third theme that continues to be brought up, the third theme that continues to be brought up is the sense of loss of a local. The loss of a local history. And here's Tangier Island, which is a community in the Chesapeake Bay, where they're facing a long history of shoreline erosion that's being exacerbated by, they will have to move to the mainland. And there's a fear of losing a long history of just a few families that have made this island from the mid-17th century. And this picture is in a local museum that they created to document the history and all of the important occasions dating back from the War of 1812, when the island was used as a staging area for the advance on Baltimore by the British, which is where the Star Spangled Banner comes from, all the way up to their basketball World Series win a few years ago, that are really important to the community's history, but are intangibles, and will be lost, save for the documentation in this museum once they move elsewhere in the Chesapeake Bay. And this is just a picture of the island, which you could see is mostly on marshland and stilts now. And then the last part is just kind of the overarching loss of identity, of moving away from a very intimate relationship with the water to moving inland. And I think the best example of this was in an interview in American Samoa, where someone said that they didn't know how to move from ocean people to mountain people, and what that meant for not just themselves, but for their village and for American Samoa as a territory. So with that, I hope that collectively, once you leave this panel, you realize that the visuals that are often seen, which depict the physical infrastructure loss from relocation and erosion and more intense storm surges, there's a really wonderful heritage behind it that also stands to be lost along with that infrastructure. And with that, I'll hand it over to Erica, who will give us the framework.
All right, thank you. And thank you again also for giving me the opportunity to represent Unhcr, the refugee agency, here on this panel. So my presentation will not be focused exclusively on heritage, but rather the way in which this discourse around heritage relates to these other discussions on the nexus of disasters, climate change, human mobility, and policy processes. And I'd like to make three main points in this intervention. The first is with regards to UNHCR's engagement on climate change more broadly, including on the task force on climate displacement here in the UF. And with regards to UNHCR's engagement on planned relocations and some guidance that were put together alongside Georgetown University and Brookings Institution. And then third, a couple opportunities for collaboration with the heritage community assembled here, and some ideas for possible cross-fertilization moving forwards. Before I begin, I just wanted to make a quick point about terminology. So terminology is extremely important in this arena, and there are many different interpretations of what the correct terminology might be. This is the one that I'm going to propose from the 2010 Cancun Adaptation Framework from the FCCC process. So paragraph 14F of that framework identifies three distinct types of human mobility in the context of climate change. These include displacement, which is predominantly forced, migration, which is often predominantly voluntary movement, and third, planned relocation. And this is a planned process in which persons or groups are move or are assisted to move away from their homes or places of temporary residence and are settled in a new location and provided with conditions to rebuild their lives. This is often carried out under the authority of a state and takes place within national borders, but can also be undertaken across international borders. And this can also take place at the individual, household, or community level. So while the work of UNHCR focuses primarily on that first area, displacement, today I'm going to speak about our work in that third area, planned relocation. So a bit of context. UNHCR has a protection mandate, so the approach to disasters and climate change stems from a protection angle. And under the interagency arrangements for internally displaced persons, UNHCR is the Global Protection Cluster Lead, which means that they provide assistance to people displaced internally after disasters since the 2000s and earlier. Indian Ocean tsunami is one example. And more recently, protection and assistance was provided after the earthquake in Ecuador, Hurricane Earl in Belize, and floods in Myanmar in 2016. However, it's become increasingly obvious that no state or international agency can respond effectively effectively to these challenges alone. One agency is not capable of responding. So UNHCR would like to underscore that this work needs to be undertaken in collaboration and partnership with others, including the heritage community. So one example of such collaboration and coordination is this platform on disaster displacement. The platform on disaster displacement is the follow-up to the Nansen Initiative, which was an intergovernmental consultation process that took place in many regions around the world, including the Pacific, to develop recommendations for a protection agenda on persons displaced in the context of climate change. And again, planned relocation was a critical part of that Nansen Initiative's work. So UNHCR is supporting this platform on disaster displacement, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions about that later. But more importantly, why are we here today in COP in Marrakesh? So the Paris Agreement provides for the creation of a task force under the Warsaw International Mechanism, or the WIM, to develop recommendations to avert, mitigate, and address climate change-related displacement. This is a milestone in terms of global commitment to address and take action on climate change and human mobility. So membership to this task force has yet to be determined. However, the TORs are developed and are available online. And this task force will include a roster of experts. And this is one area where the heritage community can really raise their voices and make recommendations about how heritage and culture is vital in understanding planned relocation and human mobility responses. So moving towards UNHCR's engagement on planned relocation. In 2014, UNHCR, in partnership with the Georgetown University and the Brookings Institute, organized an expert consultation on planned relocation, disasters, and climate change, consolidating good practices and preparing for the future in San Remo. This meeting brought together 43 experts from a range of areas, and so adaptation, development, development-induced resettlement, which is an area there's some lessons to be learned, disaster risk management, and other areas. And these representatives came from 21 countries, governments, INGOs and NGOs, and academics. And then in 2015, UNHCR, Georgetown, and Brookings put together some guidance on protecting people from disasters and environmental change through planned relocations. So this guidance document sets out some general principles to assist states and other actors, assist communities themselves, who are faced with the need to undertake planned relocation. The aspiration is that these general principles will be helpful to states and supporting actors in formulating planned relocation laws, policies, plans, and programs. So I'm going to highlight a few sections of this guidance document that are relevant to the findings presented here on the panel today. And these are, but before delving into these specific hooks that the heritage community can use, it's important to provide a little bit of background about planned relocation. So as more and more people live in locations highly vulnerable to disasters and climate change impacts, planned relocation will be one response that states can take to protect affected communities, certainly not the only response. And it's important for state actors and practitioners to draw lessons from past experiences to ensure that future movements are planned out in a way that respects human rights and is in consultation with communities that are affected and ultimately leads to positive outcomes. And that's really where the heritage community plays such a strong role. And second, planned relocation should be considered a last resort. All reasonable in situ alternatives and solutions should be explored first, unless the communities themselves have identified relocation as a primary solution. Not often the case. And lastly, well-planned relocation can be a form of disaster risk reduction, but also a form of climate adaptation. Planned relocation can be undertaken preemptively before a disaster strikes, or as a measure to avoid the longer-term impacts of climate change, as we've heard from the presentation earlier. So this is remedially, it can also be undertaken remedially after a disaster strikes. And then planned relocation, So this guidance document is based on a couple of overarching principles. And these principles are really where I see a nexus to the heritage discussions that we're presenting today. So these hooks include Principle 10, which is that planned relocation should be used as a measure of last resort, and other risk reduction or adaptation options have to be considered in a timely manner and have to be exhausted prior to undertaking a planned relocation. 11 is that planned relocation should be carried out within a rights-based framework that safeguards both individual and collective civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of relocated persons and other affected persons throughout all phases. So this includes the right to self-determination, preservation of identity and culture, and control of land and resources, particularly in Indigenous communities, but also across all communities who are experiencing relocation. Indigenous culture and Indigenous knowledge is extremely important, but it's not the only dimension to consider here. Number 12 is that the specific needs, circumstances, and vulnerabilities of relocated persons should be taken into consideration and addressed in all phases of planned relocation. And similarly, the specific rights of relocated persons should be linked to demographic and health characteristics, socioeconomic characteristics, membership in a marginalized group, special dependency on or attachment to land or local resources and opportunities, and then also prior experiences of displacement. And then finally, Principle 16 is that planned relocation should be carried out in a manner that respects and upholds the principle of family unity. And this idea of family can extend beyond your mother, sister, brother, can also be a community of extended relatives and friends in a given location. So planned relocation should be carried out in a manner that respects and maintains household community and social cohesion, as well as kinship ties. So this guidance document outlines all of those principles, as well as a legal and policy framework that would be required to carry out planned relocations under the authority of the state. And in broad terms, this institutional framework requires planning and implementation, but also information, consultation, and participation of affected communities. And there's a number of other areas that are discussed under this guidance document that I'm not going to go into right now. So as a concluding set of thoughts, I think this guidance document presents one opportunity where the heritage community assembled here can really provide insights and make sure that the voices of culture are recognized in those guidance documents. So Georgetown University, UNHCR, and Brookings, although Brookings is no longer directly involved, are currently working to make this planned relocation guidance into a set of operational guidelines. And this is an ongoing process that's going to take place over the course of 2017. So I encourage any of you who are interested in being involved to reach out to UNHCR after the side event. And the second opportunity for direct engagement of the heritage community on these issues is this task force on climate displacement in the UNFCCC process. So this is an opportunity to be involved in this roster of experts and really represent the heritage perspective. Thank you for the time, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions about UNHCR's work in this field. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Erica. We're going to hold all questions till the end, and then we'll take a bunch and answer them then. But for now, I want to hand it over to Andrew so he could pick up on some of those hooks, maybe tell us a bit what the community's already done and what they're going to do.
Okay, thank you very much, Victoria. So my name is Andrew Potts, and I'm from ICOMOS. Stands for International Council on Monuments and Sites. ICOMOS is an international NGO headquartered in Paris, focused on cultural heritage conservation. We're a network of about 10,000 government heritage administrators, ministries of culture, heritage professionals, and heritage experts in 140 countries. And what I want to do in my brief time is talk a little bit about the efforts that we are pursuing to mobilize the heritage sector, the culture sector, professionals, experts, government officials in those sectors to engage with the issue of climate mobility and displacement. So if I could give you one message today, my message is that climate displacement, climate mobility is a heritage issue, and that heritage is a climate displacement and climate mobility issue. I think you heard from Erica's presentation that the processes looking at climate mobility and displacement are quite sensitive to the issue of culture and heritage, identity. They come up all the time in the work of the relevant agencies, some of which Erica mentioned. I can tell you for certain that in the culture sector, there is a huge knowledge about the ways to conserve tangible and intangible heritage, traditional knowledge systems, indigenous science, built environment amidst a variety of stresses, including the ones from climate impacts and displacement. There's also an acute sense of tools that can be used to leverage heritage as an asset for communities under stress. But there's not a lot of connectivity between the two. And so at ICOMOS, our goal is to try to build those bridges to mainstream heritage into the climate mobility conversation, particularly in a professional context. So I want to give you a little bit of background. I'm a policy lawyer, so I apologize if this is going to be a little policy-ish. A little bit of background of where culture and heritage as a sector, as a theme, really engage in these kind of issues. Beginning about 6 or 7 years ago, as the planet geared up for the post-2015 development agenda process, the sustainable development goals and the like, the heritage community writ large did a lot of introspection about what's the role of cultural heritage in human development. And from that, adopted sort of a joint policy platform of how to engage in the processes of the post-2015 agenda, including the Sendai framework, what ultimately became the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda adopted at Habitat 3 just 2 weeks ago in Quito, Ecuador, and the development of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And by the way, there is an express goal on the safeguarding of heritage, natural and cultural heritage, to increase human resilience, sustainability, and safety in the SDGs. It's target 11.4. That process resulted in the identification of 3 key roles that heritage plays in development in general and can play in the pillars of the post-2015 UN agenda in general, in the 2030 goals. One is the role of heritage as an enabler of social cohesion and inclusion, pride of place, sense of attachment, integration of new peoples, and the like. The second is the role of heritage as a crucible for creativity and a driver of equity and inclusive economic development in communities. The accumulated wisdom of a community, its heritage, its creativity is an asset in inclusion and equity work. And it's an asset, unlike, say, financial capital, that is widely available at all levels in the community. So the role of heritage in inclusive economic development. The role of heritage in resilience, both the resilience of places, but also the resilience of cultures. And then finally, the need for stakeholder-driven, transparent mapping of cultural values. So I don't really have time to go into this, but there's been a lot of talk about, we're talking about culture today. Well, what is culture? What is heritage? Is heritage what a group of architectural historians say it is? Is heritage what the people in a community value? A lot of government processes valorize expert-driven identification of heritage. And particularly in this context, what the sector is migrating to is a more stakeholder-driven, community-based mapping of cultural values. So a different paradigm for the identification of culture in general. Okay, so with those sort of 3 themes undergirding the engagement of the heritage sector in Sendai framework, in the Paris Agreement, in New Urban Agenda, and the SDGs, let me pivot now specifically to the context of climate change. For many years, the focus of the heritage sector has been on the safeguarding of heritage from the threats and impacts of climate change. Tangible heritage, buildings with spalling concrete and molding wood because of changing climate, and also intangible heritage, social practices, traditional lifeways, indigenous knowledge systems. But how do we protect that heritage from the impacts of climate change? somewhat precipitated by this soul searching, this stock taking process that occurred in connection with the Agenda 2030 process. Really been an expansion of that into a twofold view in the context of climate change. Yes, the safeguarding function that I just mentioned, but second, how is heritage an asset? How is a community's heritage an asset for the community, a culture-based asset that is an aid to its resilience, a guide to its adaptation, a model for mitigation? And so now we see much more this kind of twofold emphasis. And to underscore the point, I have a slide here that shows the United States government's cultural heritage and climate change policy matrix. This is simply the matrix used by the U.S. government in its cultural heritage and climate change work, at least under the current administration. And you can see that it has 4 pillars: science, mitigation, adaptation, and communication. But under each of those pillars, there's 2 columns. And the left column addresses protecting, safeguarding cultural heritage from climate change. The right column, in each case, addresses ways that cultural heritage is a source of resilience and an asset for the community. And so really emphasizing in federal policy in the United States, the dual function of heritage in the climate change context. Here's a quote from the head of cultural heritage for the United States government, who says that cultural resource management must keep in mind that cultural resources are a primary source of data regarding human interactions with environmental change, and that changing climates affect the preservation and maintenance of cultural resources. So this is a policy directive, again, emphasizing a movement away from a concern only for safeguarding to this more proactive asset-based approach. Okay, so if you start then from the premise that key functions of heritage and development are the ones I outlined, the 3 I outlined at the beginning, and that you want to focus on how communities can tap into, leverage, capitalize, valorize their heritage as a source of resilience and an aid to adaptation. What are some of, so you start with that, then take the policy frameworks that Erica mentioned. So how is the heritage sector, what is the heritage sector focused on in terms of the key intergovernmental processes, the policy discussions and developments that are ongoing? One for sure is related to disaster risk reduction. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction actually does a brilliant job of articulating the role of culture and heritage in DRR as a result of a very thoughtful engagement by UNESCO, ICOMOS, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and a variety of other NGOs on the topic. I just want to note that what the Sendai framework says is that communities need to invest in cultural resilience. And this goes again to this point of the role of culture as a source of resilience. It also talks, there's also a fair amount in Sendai about protecting culture, museums, cultural institutions from the impacts of disaster. But this cultural resilience is writ large in Sendai. The need for culturally appropriate disaster risk reduction strategies, and the need to do a better job of understanding the impact of disaster on culture. So that's in Sendai. Now, localizing that, mainstreaming that, building that out into national and subnational DRR frameworks is a key focus of the culture sector. A second focus of the culture sector is addressing cultural heritage as an element of non-economic loss and damage. How is damage to culture and heritage assessed and valued in the loss and damage process, particularly in the framework expedited by the Paris Agreement? Third area of focus, policy focus, and one very much related to the first two, is the issue of the absence of good tools and metrics and indicators for understanding the impact of climate on culture and heritage. To some extent, we can do an okay job of monetizing and the impact of climate on built heritage, increased maintenance costs of buildings, the erosion, literally and figuratively, of the historic fabric of historic buildings. Even that is quite underdeveloped, but even more underdeveloped is understanding how to assess and measure the impact of climate impacts on intangible heritage, indigenous knowledge systems, traditional folkways, traditional livelihoods, and the like. you need look no farther than the IPCC's AR5, which in the high-level summary specifically says that there are insufficient methodologies for determining the extent of the impact of climate change on cultural heritage and ecosystem services for us to treat the topic within AR5. So obviously a focus is to change that before AR6 gets too far down the pike. And then finally, mainstreaming cultural heritage concerns into climate mobility and displacement work. So this topic that we have today is a high level concern of the heritage sector. So I just want to conclude now by mentioning a few of the key strategies, key themes in that regard. So I say that heritage has made integrating, engaging climate displacement and climate mobility issues a focus. What are the key messages that we're bringing? And in finishing up with these points, I am focusing on planned relocation, the context that Erica mentioned. There's a lot of work being done on the role of cultural heritage, say, for example, the valorization of indigenous knowledge systems as strategies for avoiding displacement and allowing people to remain in their traditional homes, which I think, as Victoria's presentation compellingly depicted, is the passion and desire of most peoples. But what I'm going to talk about now is this issue, is the question of planned relocation, because when tenure becomes, when remaining in place becomes untenable, the threats to the culture of the community, the conservation of that culture amidst diaspora, refugee status and the like becomes the most pronounced. So focusing on planned relocation. So the first is the question of, these are actually not in really the order I wanted to present. Okay, the first is when a community has decided to move, it's often inevitable that some of their heritage, particularly their built heritage, will have to be left behind, abandoned, lost, submerged, and the like. We have right now in the United States, perhaps you've read about this, the Ile de Jean Charles town in the state of Louisiana, which is the first United States town in the continental United States that is being comprehensively relocated as a result of the climate impacts of their islet home. And one of the first issues that arose is that what is it, Victoria? $50 million that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has made available for this test case of the planned relocation of American community doesn't include enough money to disinter and move the community cemetery. And now a number of community residents are saying they won't leave unless the cemetery, the graveyard, is also moved. But under US law, the disinterment and relocation of graves is extremely expensive. And so already we have this issue of the abandonment of tangible heritage. So this is something the heritage sector is excellent at. If we know how to do anything, it's to inventory, document heritage. And so everything from high-tech strategies like 3D laser scanning of monuments to oral histories, a whole variety of ways that we know how to document tangible heritage. The picture here is of a laser scanning. You've seen these inventorying strategies deployed in new contexts, for example, with the intentional destruction of heritage in Iraq and Syria. Now, these people are on the ground frantically laser scanning to produce 3D models of World Heritage sites before they get blown up. So that technology can be transferred to communities that are abandoning heritage so that future generations will have whatever the technology is in the future, a CD-ROM with a 3D scan of the community's abandoned heritage, for example. So the inventorying and documentation of tangible heritage that has to be abandoned. The second is the conservation of intangible heritage, traditional knowledge, movable heritage amidst displacement. So languages, knowledge, indigenous science, craft, how does this know-how, this wisdom of the community be conserved amidst the stress of dislocation? And very much to the point of Oliver made at the outset, a lot of the science, this wisdom, this knowledge is place-based. In fact, sometimes we call it deep place-based knowledge because it is such a profound and deep understanding of the particularities of a particular spot on the globe. Often quite transferable and usable in other contexts, but fragile. And so amidst movement, how is that knowledge conserved? Then finally, the role of cultural heritage as a tool of integration, social cohesion, and emplacement. There are a variety of heritage-based strategies to help people thrive in their new locations. The picture here is of a refugee camp in Jordan, Syrian refugees, with a program that uses gardening, community gardening, as an emplacement tool. But they found that the program is most effective when a particular feature is present, and that is that the herbs and vegetables that are planted are ones from their home, from where these people came from. So using a kind of a culturally specific dimension to this strategy. Also, the use of cultural heritage as a tool of social inclusion. I think there's a misimpression that heritage is somehow, the ownership of heritage is genetic. I'm interested, or I own, even just figuratively, heritage because of some involvement of my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents in that. That's not the premise of heritage. The owners of tangible heritage are whoever is occupying the spot where it exists at the moment. So when you relocate to a new place, the existing heritage, the monuments, the cathedrals, the mosques, what have you, of that place you become a co-steward and a co-owner of that heritage. So how do you, that becomes a common bond, a common modality to bring together new arrivals and longtime residents. So these are the types of topics that we are trying to bring forth into the frameworks that Erica alluded to. And more broadly, this is the focus of the heritage community in this context at a policy level. I'll just conclude by saying, reiterating the point I made at the outset, that about every spot on the globe has a heritage bureaucracy, a ministry of culture, a department of historic preservation, an office, a municipal office of cultural heritage. And those offices are stocked with anthropologists, archaeologists, architectural historians, folks who have amazing skill sets that are highly relevant to this work, but very few of them are sensitized to the possibilities of deploying their skills in this context. And so any community that is thinking about climate mobility, climate displacement, if you haven't been called up by your local heritage officials, then I urge you to reach out to them and entreat them to put their skills to this important purpose. And that Victoria, turn it back to you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrew. All right, we're going to turn it over to our final presenter, Espen Romberg, who is going to give us a presentation from the Pacific Experience. No.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting SPREP to this event. SPREP is the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. We're based in Samoa, but we serve 21 small island countries and territories in the Pacific. And we've had a climate change program for many years. Personally, I've been working on climate change now for 25 years. So, I've been called one of the dinosaurs in this process by one of my former friends now. So just wanted to bring this in from the context of the negotiations as well, because the issue of culture and non-economic loss and damage is very much part of the discussions and the issues that the Pacific are bringing to the loss and damage debate. And just a little bit of a context, the Pacific Island countries are extremely vulnerable. Of course, there are some that are a little more vulnerable than others, but when you look at, for example, economic activities and so forth, you'll find that it's mostly in the coastal zone. We also have 4 of the 6 most low-lying islands. They are in the Pacific. In countries like Samoa, where most of the productive sector is located in the coast, it's actually quite difficult to, it's equally difficult to move any of that similar to what you saw in the video from Kiribati. Well, in Kiribati, there is no space. In Samoa, there is space, but it's a steep hill. It'll be costly, and that land belongs to somebody. So relocating the airport, for example, would take a tremendous effort and would probably not happen before the sea level actually took it over. And one of the other premises that that the Pacific have brought into this discussion is that there basically are limits to adaptation, and there's limits to what we can do through current mainstreaming and project-based approaches. Non-economic losses that I just wanted to highlight. I'm actually have to apologize. I don't think I have any specific examples from Samoa. It's actually from the whole of the region. So I may have misled you when we had a chat earlier. But thinking about how culture is impacted by climate change, and there's some harbingers we can see of things to come when you look at what happens in the Pacific during the various extreme events and disasters that we've experienced. 2004, Cyclone Heta destroyed the only museum on the island of Niue. 95% of the collection there was destroyed. That is quite a significant single event, and it just shows a bit of an example about what can happen in small island countries. There's also been some discussion about internal migration. Now that is occurring in the Pacific, but we've given very little consideration to non-economic losses in that context. But that is something that we have to do for the longer term. Some of the other impacts of climate change, like coral bleaching. Now, the coral reef and the near shore is very, very important to Pacific Island cultures for a variety of reasons. It's an economic sector for fisheries. It's also a cultural thing. Once a year, for example, in the Samoan Islands, we have something called the Palolo Rise, and it's something that happens only only around that time of year, and it's a cultural event, and it is being impacted by coral bleaching, because this year we had a very, very bad catch. The previous speaker also mentioned ecosystem services and so on. Now, we've done a little bit of ecosystem-based adaptation projects in the region, and we were able to do a bit of cost-benefit analysis. So while on the one hand we can put a value to some of the services that the ecosystems provide, we can't put the same costing or valuation to the cultural and heritage values that those ecosystems provide. But we do know that we can put a figure to it, and that's helpful when arguing against certain types of developments occurring versus natural solutions. Loss of traditional knowledge and agricultural practices is also something that's happening throughout the region. For example, in Palau, traditional agriculture, particularly for taro, has largely been in the coastal zone, but the coastal zone is getting increasingly inundated, and it's creating challenges for those communities because they like that particular type of taro. You can't force them to grow some other form of taro when they're not going to eat it. What's the point? Some pictures about some of the stark issues that are facing the atolls. I mean, you saw a much better representation of this in the video, but these are pictures from the Marshall Islands where I used to work, and it's a graveyard that's being steadily eroded by sea level rise and storm surges. And the chief secretary of the Marshall Islands was quoted when these pictures were taken as saying, "And so, even in death, the presence of climate change lingers." We've done some research in the region. We did a gap analysis specifically on all the areas of loss and damage, but that also takes up the migration, relocation, and displacement issues. We were only able to do it for 3 countries, but we had some generic action points coming out of that. It basically comes down to resources, personnel training, and in-country expertise needing to be developed. Now, migration as adaptation has been mentioned in the negotiations and also here today. We have to, from our perspective, we need to look at it in the context of the Pacific and the situation. We had under the Nansen Initiative one of the first regional workshops, and a very strong message came out of that, that relocation and migration were absolutely the last resort. Some of our members didn't even want the workshop to happen because they really didn't want, they were fearful of a situation where we would end up in a cost-benefit analysis situation, that it would be cheaper to relocate 10 million Pacific Islanders than it would be to take action on climate change. Of course, that type of cost-benefit analysis, as we've heard, it doesn't take into account anything relating to cultural ties, cultural losses, even loss of lives, of course. But I have to say that relocation has been used as adaptation in the region to date, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that, because it's in a very particular context. We had a project in Vanuatu about 12 years ago, and it was in a particular village that was heavily impacted by storm surges, inundation, and so on. They're having problems with their freshwater situation, and their farms and their housing situations was getting a bit intolerable. So the intervention that we did there was through a very, very inclusive consultative process, which is quite interesting to carry out in the Pacific. It's not like in any other part of the world, I think. You would have consultations with the male chiefs, with the female chiefs, with the male workers, with the female workers, with the youth, with the pastors, with the different consultations with different parts of the community. They couldn't be consulted together, had to be separate. And as a result of that, a plan was drafted up based on inputs from all those different parts of the community. And the village was basically relocated, but not too far away. It was only about 500 meters. They had rights to that land, and there were some parts of the land that they didn't have rights to, that they had to be secure with a neighboring clan, but they were able to do it. It was a tremendous success in that they were able to maintain their agricultural practices. They were able to maintain their fisheries practices because they were still within sight of the ocean, and they were now much safer off than they were. Now, this last point here, it was something that we were asked to do a monitoring and evaluation report of this project. And it was something that none of us at that time had actually done, according to this type of format. So the metric that we used was that normally when these villages, or this particular village, has a feast, they would maybe roast about 2 or 3 pigs. Of this, they roasted 100. As a show of appreciation, I guess. Another project in Vanuatu that's currently about to be completed is on an island that also is facing coastal erosion issues and threats to the community. In this case, we also carried out this type of community consultation, but we were assisted by a method that's actually quite simple, but very effective, 3D mapping. And it allowed us to have a much more in-depth discussion with the parts of the community about what the options were. So here's a picture of one group of people looking at this 3D map. It shows where the current villages are. It shows what type of topography and land there is. It shows where the road goes. And they were able to, through this process, to relocate not only the road, but also certain key parts of the infrastructure. And it wasn't just with the men of the village. It was the school kids as well. And also with, as I mentioned, with the different women's groups and the chiefs, etc. So just some concluding remarks, and that for the Pacific, there's a great deal of complexity when it comes to cultural considerations. This is different from country to country. It's different from island to island. but it is incredibly important. The culture provides for your ties to the land, your ties to the community. There is just so much that culture brings to social cohesion and to the sense of belonging. In fact, in some communities in the Pacific, the umbilical cord of a newborn is buried in the ancestral lands. So it gives you an impression of how important that is. Now, as I mentioned, migration and relocation is actually occurring, but there are cultural impacts of that. When we have a number of examples where basically forced relocation has occurred, and some of the social and cultural impacts of that have been tremendously destructive on communities. I won't go into that in detail now, but if you have questions about it, I could give you a heap of examples from the region. We also have to be very cognizant of the capacity constraints amongst Pacific Island countries. We have small populations, small administrations, and it's a big challenge for us as we try and address not just loss and damage, but climate change as a whole. And I mentioned this bit about land tenure is another important consideration. Cooperation amongst not just us, the regional agencies, but with all development partners and interested organizations is very, very important. And it's crucial if we are going to support the Pacific Island countries in their aspirations in combating climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Espen. So we have just over 20 minutes for questions and answers. So I'll open it up to the audience. If I could just ask if people could please introduce themselves briefly before they ask their questions so we know who we're talking to. Yeah, the gentleman first. The mic is coming.
Hi. Hi.
Pronunciate.
My name is Sidhu. I come from Senegal, working on the Ministry of Culture. Sorry. Put it close to your mouth. Hi, everybody. My name is Seydou. I come from Senegal, in West Africa. I'm working on the Ministry of Culture. And sorry for my bad English, I speak French, but I will read. I have one question for Mr. Maurice and Mr. Potts. You know, in my country, we have two sites which are registered on the UNESCO World Heritage List, Gore Island and St. Louis Island. Yeah, these two sites are faced on climate change phenomenon because they are close to the ocean. And now I would like to know if you have programs in your organization which can train people, the communities, on how to manage this phenomenon without spoiling the integrity of the site. This was my question. Thanks you.
I wants to know if there's programs to help the World Heritage Sites adapt.
So for anyone who didn't hear the question, it's a question about if there are technical and capacity building programs for communities to help them adapt cultural heritage sites while keeping the integrity of that site and of the community in mind.
And specifically a World Heritage Site, right? Yeah,
Yes.
San Luis, yeah, see, yeah.
I have to be honest and say that INTU is an organization that is at a sort of lower level in terms of sites than UNESCO. UNESCO is the organization that looks after World Heritage Sites. INTU, yes, amongst our membership, we do have a few World Heritage Sites, but actually we're talking about the looking after the national sites rather than the world sites. So, I mean, national, regional sites that are important to the local communities. We're not actually talking so much about World Heritage Sites. But in terms of programs for World Heritage Sites. Andrew, I think maybe you'd be actually more able to answer that one.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know, the World Heritage Program, it's actually an international convention. 193 countries participate, where states parties, where governments can nominate sites of outstanding universal value to an inventory maintained by UNESCO. The inscription of a site on the World Heritage List brings along with it treaty obligations under the convention to conserve the heritage of the site. The sites can be natural, cultural, or mixed natural and cultural. In 2006, the World Heritage Committee, which is a committee of the states parties that are signatories to the convention, issued a guidelines on the management of World Heritage sites in the face of climate change. But those, in my opinion, those guidelines are now outdated. They're over 10 years old, and there are a variety of deficiencies in them. So at a policy level, there's an increasingly urgent need for the World Heritage Committee to update those guidelines. There are just a couple thousand World Heritage sites in the world, but because they're iconic and often the best resourced and most paid attention to built heritage, tangible heritage places, the practices that go on in those sites end up becoming the state of the art in the heritage sector. So the updating of UNESCO's the World Heritage Committee's guidelines on the management of World Heritage sites in the face of climate change could do a lot to improve the state of practice around the world for all heritage places. So that's just a general observation. In terms of programs, a good thing about being a World Heritage Site is it does give you an additional entry point, a platform in the UN system. In fact, I thought that UNDP, the UN Development Program, did do a study of Saint Louis. Am I remembering correctly? Right. So I mean, it's an example of the ability of those sites to attain some attention. But in terms of the actual interventions that can be made in the landscape for adaptation, this becomes the critical question. So UNESCO, I can give you later the name. There's a woman, Susanna Kari, maybe you know her. She's the World Heritage Specialist for Africa at UNESCO, and also the climate change coordinator for the World Heritage Program. So she's an excellent resource, but I think Susanna will tell you that the program, there is a small grant and aid initiative for Africa at UNESCO, and then in South Africa through the African Regional Center for World Heritage. So two small possibilities, but there are also other NGOs that are interested in the adaptation of World Heritage sites in Africa, one of them being the World Monuments Fund in New York, WMF, who has a project right now in Tanzania. It's actually a desertification project, but the craft and the science of it, though, is emerging. So you all will be part of the emerging question of how do you adapt sites without destroying their authenticity and their integrity, which is your real issue. I mean, the mud and lime and granite, I mean, that's not heritage. Heritage are the values inscribed on the heritage resources, and when you adapt them, you can destroy the values that made them heritage to the community. So how do you reconcile the engineering, if I could say that, of adaptation with the conservation of the values that make the site special to the community is absolutely ground zero of the cultural heritage sector in this space, and I think the innovation in many cases will be at World Heritage sites because of the reasons I mentioned.
All right, we'll take a few questions and then give them to the panel. So we'll start on this side of the room and then here. And there was one in the back. Okay.
Hello. Hello? Oh yeah, thanks. I am Kees van der Geest of United Nations University. I think that the feeling of loss is much more when somebody's forced to migrate than when it's this person's own choice, right? So I think that's probably a disadvantage of relocation when a whole community yeah, is sort of forced to move, even if that is the loss is reduced by some consultative process when they're involved. But lately I've been hearing quite a bit about assisted migration, where instead of a whole community moving, people are given an opportunity to leave an area that is at risk of climate change, for example. So I just wanted to, I've not heard much in this panel about assisted migration, which I think is very relevant for the panel. So I just would like to hear your thoughts about this concept.
I'm Cecile Guidote Alvarez of the Earth Savers, a UNESCO Artist for Peace. And we're really glad that, you know, culture is here in terms of a side event, because it's the most marginalized ingredient, which is actually the womb for education. That's why it was very interesting. We have an exhibit on the plight of refugees, the faces, the scourge of sorrow that must be hopefully conscientizing, a call for immediate humanitarian comprehensive response to these refugees. We, like any of the small islands in the Pacific, we're archipelagic. We are visited by incredible kinds of super typhoons, and one of the most vivid you've seen was Haiyan, where the Pope had to come, UN Secretary General had to come, everybody was coming. But up to now, we have tent cities for them. The housing supposedly has not really been completed. Not only that, but also they are degraded conditions. What can be the response to this? For instance, is there any country now, I've asked our delegation, to input more cultural items into the agreement? What
Great.
cultural items or
Can be in the agreement.
ingredients are already there in the Paris Agreement, and here modification for adaptation?
One more.
Great. Hi, I'm Salate Sonko from the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. We're a human rights organization, and we support environmental defenders around the world. In the context of development, a lot of the communities that we work with are battling with droughts and sea level rise and all those long-term impacts of climate change. But at the same time, they're battling with corporate organizations that are coming into their land, destroying their resources, and therefore displacing these communities, most of which are permitted by states. So my question is, in the context of heritage protection, how does that extend to disaster risk reduction in that context?
Great, thank you. All right, so we have a question on disaster risk reduction and cultural heritage, one about including cultural assets and processes, and one on the differences between forced relocation and assisted migration. Does anyone want to start with any of those?
I actually thought that the words assisted migration sounded very much like planned relocation in a sense. If it's across borders, that's one thing. If it's within a country, that's another thing. I mean, the terminology, whichever words you choose to use, you still have to define what it is that you mean. So we're pretty much sticking to the platform for disaster displacement type of terminology in how we're working through the issues. But it's a question about how to phrase it. I'm running out of time. I just wanted to also pick up on this point about culture not being prominent in the Paris Agreement. From my perspective and from a lot of my colleagues' perspectives, there's a lot of things that aren't in the agreement. But when you read the agreement as a whole, we find that we can embed the things that are missing, the words that are missing. We, of course, have had a very strong view on the inclusion of the ocean in the Paris Agreement, and it's not at all prominent. But in retrospect, having gone through the different elements, we find that we can cover our concerns when it comes to ocean issues and climate change with what we already have on the table. So we shouldn't be too discouraged by the fact that some words are missing and some concepts are missing. I think we can build them in the implementation.
I really appreciate your observation about and I want to say that I liked Erica's analogy earlier to hooks. The two best hooks I know of are SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 11.4, which is safeguarding of natural and cultural heritage for resilience, sustainability, inclusiveness, and safety. And in Sendai, there are 6 sections that talk about the role of cultural heritage and disaster risk reduction. Also a good statement on cultural heritage and resilience in the New Urban Agenda that came out of Habitat 3. So I think that's enough to work with, but the problem is it's been a largely top-down process of getting those provisions included. So now that we come to localization, now we come to getting regional and sub-regional and local implementation, it's where the real effort will be, because you find many states parties, when they're starting to report out, for example, on their implementation of SDG Goal 11, they just skip 11.4. They ignore it. They report on the other 7 targets. So we have to work at the national and subnational level to start to build out and implement the provisions that we got.
All right, unfortunately, do you have a last comment, a quick one?
Very quickly, I just wanted to thank you for raising this distinction between forced and voluntary, and how the feelings of loss are in some ways worse when the movement is forced to migrate. And this concept of assisted migration, as was already reiterated, is an abstract one, and I think it's ultimately terminology that can be renegotiated and re-envisioned depending on the context and who's speaking.
Right, unfortunately, we are over time now, but I want to thank everyone for their insightful questions, and those who I didn't get to, please come find the panelists afterwards. We'll be up here for a few minutes before running to our next iteration of this event. But thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for our panelists, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. We should work on it.
Yeah.
We had